Your mics are on.
Good morning.
Please turn them on. Ready to go.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the May 2nd special meeting of Glendale City Council, being called to order at 10:09. May we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Agajanian.
Present.
Present.
Councilmember Devine.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Sinanian.
Here.
Mayor Garabetian.
Here. And what's next, please?
The agenda for May the 2nd, 2017 special public meeting of the City Council was posted on Friday, April 28th, 2017 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
And what is next?
One would be Director of Finance regarding third quarter financial report. 1A, motion to note and file the fiscal year 2016-17 third quarter financial report for the period ended March 31st, 2017.
Thank you, Mr. Rocha.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Congratulations on being the mayor, and we'll endeavor to move forward with this budget process in as much detail as council would like, and still respect the time that you have put in, this being budget study session number 1 of a proposed, or at least an anticipated 3, that will lead us towards the adoption in June. We have a great deal of information to go to, as is our custom, and it was funny, we were remarking this is now my 5th budget with the City of Glendale, and I think we've gotten it to a point where we provide a good dashboard of data for City Council with which to make policy, and I think ultimately you'll be able to see as we get through this budget that the direction, the vision, the responsibility that is espoused by the City Council is reflected in the operations of all of the staff that you see here in the room. So for today, as has become our custom, we'll be looking at the third quarter update. We'll have a projection for year end. We will seek direction from council with respect to the creation or inclusion of the Section 115 trust, and provide the general fund forecast as we have done previously. We'll also talk later about the proposed 17-18 budget, and spoiler alert, things are good. They aren't great, but they are good. They're solid, they're balanced, and we anticipate another productive year moving forward. We will also provide some information, because the question has come up, what happens if the general fund transfer is lost, and we want to be able to provide some information to you to give you a framework with which to make policy, and then we'll go through the normal organizational profile information that we provide to you so you can get some comparative snapshot of other agencies. And last but not least, at the request of the mayor, we have provided some information just by way of the budget creation process, what we go through to get to this point and where we'll go going forward, as well as the assortment of funds that make up the overall financial structure of the city. So I think that will be a benefit to the folks who are watching, and it's always a good refresher for us as staff and you as policymakers. And then we'll lead off into the upcoming budget study sessions as we move forward. As I said, this is the 5th budget study session, and it's funny to see how things bleed together, and I will endeavor to not give you, as I did with our newest council member, last year's numbers, but rather this year's numbers, because the numbers do blend together when there are that many of them. As I say, we are in a very good position at this point in time. Revenues that we have received through the third quarter of 2017, fiscal year 2017, we are up, and a lot of that has to do with the early repayment of the redevelopment loan. As you recall, the City Council sued the state of California, and you were successful in securing what amounts to a little over, or nearly $40 million in old redevelopment tax increment that was owed from the former redevelopment agency to the city. And you will recall, and you'll see when we get to the 5-year financial forecast, that we had those dollars programmed on a repayment schedule into the general fund. The state of California, I think in an effort to be simply done with former redevelopment agencies, not the least of which the Glendale redevelopment agency, is prepaying us those monies. So we will get the same amount of money, we'll just get it over a shorter period of time. But aside from that increase in revenue due to the GRA loan, we're also seeing good economic activity from property tax, from sales tax, from utility user tax revenues, from the hotel tax that was increased 2 years ago as championed by this council. So The net result is that we do see an increase. We do see the financial planning that the council had outlined coming to fruition. Up to the number of $4.1 million in ongoing revenues for charges for service. What does that look like in graph form? You see we adopted the budget, $54 million property taxes, $39 million sales taxes, 28.7 in utility user taxes. Those are the big three for us. The transfer there near the bottom at the 21.306 is primarily the general fund transfer from GWP. Adjustments that have been made over the course of this current fiscal year, those are the adjustments that Armin Harkalian, our revenue manager, brings to us based on what we're seeing in the market. And those adjustments are reflected there under revised resources. Don't be too concerned at this point when you see the actual receipts, however, because as you know, the biggest chunks of our money, the property tax and sales tax, come somewhat delayed. So while we have $121 million received in the general fund, that represents 57.6% of our revenues. That's not uncommon. That's generally a reflection of the way that the money comes in, both from sales tax and from property tax. Yes, sir.
Yes,
Before you get too deep into this, the additional payments from the state, both for last year and this upcoming year, what happens to that money? Is that set aside, or is that being allocated as part of the budget to be spent?
It is in the general fund reserve, sitting there awaiting for some appropriation from council.
So the money that has already come in, that's sitting somewhere, and the money that will come in the next fiscal year will also
That's correct,
go
sir.
there until and unless allocated to a specific project.
That's correct, sir.
Okay.
All right. In terms of expenditures, all the departments are tracking. We are at about 71%, a little bit lower than what we were last year at this time, 72.6%. So everyone is at the 75% or below, which is good for 3 quarters into the year. You will see that the transfers are exceeding due to the exceeding the mark due to 20% of the money that has come in, as you know, of the GSA loan, the successor agency, the former redevelopment agency. Those dollars that we get repaid, 20% of that money by law has to go into the Affordable Housing Fund. So you will see an increase by way of expenditure. That's how it's represented here. That the transfers are out of whack for every other department. Again, that reflects the 20% of the GSA money that has to be moved into affordable housing. If you recall, when we had redevelopment agencies, 20% of the set aside, or 20% of the tax increment had to be set aside for affordable housing as well.
Excuse me, what is that amount, that 20%, what would that equate to?
20% of the $9.5 million, is that right?
Almost $2 million.
Almost $2 million, I believe. Yeah.
Okay.
See the quick math? The mayor's a numbers guy. And you will see here, as I mentioned at the beginning, we do have some pending third quarter adjustments. With the departments coming in under budget, or at least holding the line with revenues a little stronger than even we had anticipated, we do expect that there will be an opportunity for some one-time funding in the current fiscal year that we would ask, as you'll see in just a bit, that we move those over into capital improvement funds for needed projects. So what this chart shows you is our beginning fund balance in the general fund. So we talk about the general fund reserve, and Mr. Snanian had asked the question as to prepaid monies, where do they go? Until they are programmed, they're sitting in that general fund reserve. So $80 million, representing 41.5% of our general fund. That is a superfunded reserve at this point in time. Now, you will recall, as you show here in italics, that we had $10.8 million at mid-year that we had asked the council, also partial in answer to Mr. Snanian's question, do we have any appropriations, or what happens until there is an appropriation? The money sits there in the reserve. We were asking to appropriate $10.8 million of that excess revenue into the Section 115 PERS Trust. Council had deadlocked at that time, and now, as we move forward with a full council, we are bringing that matter to you again for discussion. For purposes of that discussion, you can see that we net out the $10.8 million from the beginning fund balance. You see the beginning fund balance for 7/1/16 is that adjusted $70 million, still representing 36% of the general fund overall. 36%.
That would be if we take out the amount and put it in the
Trust fund.
the trust
That initial
fund,
amount, the 10.8
we'd still
million.
have 36%.
You'd still have 36 as of for that last fiscal year. That's where you see the 15-16 fiscal year number. When you look at revenue adjustments, you see that increase that I showed you previously, $4.1 million in new ongoing revenue, the $9.5 million that came in from GSA represented in the $13 million there. So revised 16-17 current fiscal year resources, $207,347,000. Now, when you look at the appropriations, we began with $194 million. One-time adjustments that were approved by the City Council, you see $4.1 million in budget carryovers. These are projects that the Council had already approved and appropriated money for, but such monies were not expended. In the context of our accounting, those monies would otherwise fall back to the undesignated fund balance. In order to make it a little more understandable for council as well as for the public, we asked let's just that we carry over those dollars. So we show the 4.1, that money is already spoken for. There are checks written on the account for that $4.1 million relating to a number of different projects. You have the 20% transfer of money from regarding the GSA loan, the redevelopment loan that goes to the Low Mod Housing Fund for about $1.9 million. You recall that we set aside money for the currently ongoing firefighter recruit training academy. We held that out of the chief's budget because we knew that that would be a one-time cost and not something that we wanted to inflate his budget for the current fiscal year. And the council also set aside money on a one-time basis for investments in the continuum of care, some homeless programming. The military banner program was a small chunk. The historic resources survey. There was the gain share and the general funds portion of that, as well as the savings incentive program for general fund departments. You will recall that departments that do not expend all of their dollars at the end of the year are entitled under this program to keep $50,000 for departmental projects, for departmental programs. They cannot accumulate more than 2 years worth of funding, so a maximum of $100,000. But the idea being that we want to have an incentive so that employees, so that staff, so that departments don't get to the end of the fiscal year with a mad dash to spend everything that they have, because a lot of times you will look upon this as a use it or lose it type of system. And so the idea is if you save money, you get to have an incentive to profit share, if you will, with your department, understanding that these SIP dollars can't go to staff, they can't go to ongoing types of costs. They can only go towards things like staff training, enrichment, some limited capital that can be, again, accumulated for a relatively small amount of money, $100,000. So all of that adds up to that $1.786 million. The recurring costs that the council included in this current fiscal year's budget are reflected in that $2.3 million. That's primarily the MOU budgets, as well as a couple of other smaller items. So the total revised appropriation for the current fiscal year, $206,291,000. Now, let's take a look as we go for the fund balance as of June 30th, what we expect by June 30th of this current fiscal year, so the end of the fiscal year. We are projecting a $1 million, a little over a $1 million surplus. So that is where we expect all of our departments to be, coming in under what their budget was. You see that $4 million that we have there that is being taken into account. We expect actually that we would be about $5 million under budget. However, we are asking you to take $1 million, put it into the street maintenance fund because, as you recall from the pavement management index that was presented and, to council and approved, we need to continue putting monies into street maintenance in order to keep that the PMI at or above 72, a score of 72, which I think is a benefit to all of our neighborhoods, all of our business districts. We are asking that we seed the building maintenance fund with about $1 million. You'll recall that we had begun charging departments an internal service fee. This past year, we established the building maintenance fund to take on projects, repairs that need to be done, a roofing project, any kind of significant repair, something short of the type of complete renovation that you saw recently in the Central Library. But these are the types of projects year by year that are being paid for catch as catch can. Now we are assessing departments for the building maintenance, but we'd like to jumpstart that fund to the tune of $1 million for what will probably be an oversubscribed service. Most notably, we are asking that you move $2 million into the CIP fund for the Fremont Park renovation project. You'll recall when the council adopted the DIF strategic plan that we had a significant amount of money that was programmed for Fremont Park, yet, as you know, because DIF funds can only be used for new amenities, not necessarily the replacement of existing amenities, the project needed additional funding. This additional funding, this $2 million, will allow us to continue with design development and start that project, which will include a smaller soccer field for the little guys. It'll renovate the playground area and provide just a host of really neat amenities in Fremont Park, for a park that has become rather tired, allow us to jumpstart that project as we go through this year. So you see, as I had mentioned, we expected to end that year about $5 million. We'll end it at about $1 million to the good. That leaves us with the beginning fund balance at the end of this current fiscal year of $72,497,000, or 37% of the general fund. To Councilmember Devine's question about the 10.8 that we showed on the previous slide, that was held over from last year's budget. That is still sitting in limbo in the general fund reserve. We would also ask that if council was willing to establish the 115 trust, we would put in an additional $13.2 million in the current fiscal year and as part of the overall funding strategy that we'll talk about in just a second. If you were to do that, that takes your projected ending unassigned charter reserve, the general fund reserve, to a little over $59 million, or 30%. As you know, the charter requires that the city council maintain in the general fund reserve for basically emergencies as a rainy day fund, 1/2 of the property tax for that year. In this case, that would be $27 million, because we get about $54 million, scheduled to get about $54 million in the coming year. So this $59 million far outstrips what the charter requires. But the city council historically has had a 30% reserve level with a 35% target. So you can see that after the close of this current fiscal year, and if you were to establish the Section 115 trust with last year's appropriation that was requested, this year's appropriation that would be requested, you're still north of 30%. Let's talk about that PERS stabilization fund. What you see here is the history of PERS rates over the last 30 years or more. The safety rate is the rate that is charged for all police and fire employees, sworn safety employees. That number, going back to the mid-'80s, was rather high, 32.49. The miscellaneous rate for all other employees, basically non-safety, was about 20%. You see through the improving economies of the 1980s and then the overheated economies of the 1990s, the resulting impact was that there was a pension holiday in 2000, fiscal year 2000, meaning that our PERS bill for that fiscal year was zero. And during that period of time, the state of California had provided a very lucrative benefit to some of its public safety employees. That benefit trickled down, as you know this story already probably ad nauseum, but it's probably worth recounting. That benefit trickled down to municipalities in the form of the 3 at 50 system, and in the miscellaneous case, 2.5 at 55. The mantra from PERS at that point in time was that they're making enough money in stock market, they're making enough money in their commercial real estate portfolio, that the new economy knew no bounds, or at least didn't play by the same rules as the old economy. Of course, Newtonian physics was proven right, and what went up did in fact come down. And you saw that by 2004, 2005, PERS was not only charging rates for employers and employees, but charging at a very significant clip, reflecting the new promises that had been made, as well as the demographic profile of the workforce and those who were entering retirement as part of the PERS promise and PERS system. Take heart that Glendale has historically been a fiscally conservative city. And as a result, while you did go to 3 at 50 because it would be awfully hard to recruit police officers and firefighter, paramedics, and engineers, particularly not going to that promise, that you still held the line 2.5 at 55 for miscellaneous, not going with some of the lucrative benefits, and certainly not going with some of the more exotic benefits that were allowed by PERS during this point in time. What you see in the bottom half of that slide, is the ongoing creep of the rates that are moving up, and up to what are, quite frankly, unprecedented levels. 45% for safety, 26.5% for miscellaneous. What does that mean to us? Why are they going up that much? I would direct you to the first bullet point, the normal cost. This is a term that through your briefings with staff, you probably realize, or you recognize two terms here: unfunded accrued liability and the normal cost. The unfunded accrued liability, or UAL, represents effectively past sins. That's the $400 million gap between the $1.2 billion in assets that we have with PERS and the $1.6 billion in liability. When you look at the normal cost, the 18.8% for safety and the 8.3% for miscellaneous, that doesn't seem nearly as terrifying when you look at this slide. We could handle 18.3 and the 8.3 for miscellaneous, but why are those numbers not 18.8 and 8.3 respectively? It's because while PERS is charging us that normal cost, which is what the cost would be for the current crop of employees with the current promise as they move forward through their employment and into retirement, they are also trying to recoup the UAL. So what you see in the bottom half of this slide is 45.03% for the safety rate, 26.57% for the miscellaneous rate, which reflects the normal cost as well as the recoupment of the UAL, that unfunded accrued liability. PERS at this point, as they are becoming more realistic in their assessment of their projections and reducing their discount rate, is passing those costs on, as you would expect in a pension system, to the member agencies, and that is impacting us, as we'll show you in a second, and will impact us over the course of the next 20 years. What you see here on the far right-hand side is simply the dollar depiction of the normal cost for us and the UAL, effectively our PERS bill going forward. So in the coming year, citywide, we're looking at $50.3 million, and by 22-23, on the outside of our 5-year financial forecast, we're seeing that number move up to $27 million, $27.5 million to $77.9 million. This is an important slide because it tells you what our strategy effectively is. Moving from right to left, if you look at general fund percentage net of cost share, as I mentioned, Glendale has been historically very conservative. Not only has the city council mandated that employees pay the full employee share, also, as you know, by negotiating with our labor partners, the city has been able to ensure that the employees pay a portion of the employer share. Again, I think that there are probably a handful, less than 5, maybe a couple, 3 cities in the state of California where the employees pay as great a cost, certainly not more, but as great a cost of their own employment as they do here in Glendale. So you see the net of cost share is the net bill from the general fund, not the entire city, but from the general fund that we pay to PERS, and the far right-hand side tells you what that percentage is of the general fund. The last point I'll make on this slide is that you recall our goal is to keep that number below 20%.
Socha,
Yes,
second. Councilmember Najarian
So,
has a question.
you kind of glossed over it, and we're all very familiar with that, but please explain to us the commitment that our Glendale employees have made in picking up not only their share of the pension liability, but also the employer's share, and how rare an occurrence that is in the state of California for the employees to partner and vest or reinvest in the city as much as our employees do. I think that's critical. It's, we've talked about it, and if you just say it out there, people don't really necessarily understand it. It's not an organic, intuitive sort of thing. But please repeat exactly what additional investment our employees are making. This is through bilateral agreements.
Yes, sir.
To reduce the city's burden and to increase their burden on their own pension benefits.
Yes, sir. Throughout the 1990s and even before that, many cities would negotiate with their employee associations and unions to pick up the employee cost. For miscellaneous, that's 8% is the employee rate. For public safety, it's 9%. So rather than give their police association an increase, they would pick up a portion of the employee share of the PERS cost. That didn't happen in Glendale, or at least Glendale has maintained that the employee shall pay that share. But to your point, going further, through the 2000s, through the last decade and a half, City Council has negotiated bilaterally and in good faith with its associations, going to unilateral impasse only one time, which is exceedingly rare for the benefit that the city has realized. And that benefit is reflected that the employee pays the employee share, which, believe it or not, is a novel occurrence, or has been in California among municipalities. But the employees in Glendale also pay a portion of the employer's share. So to the extent that we look at GCEA, for example, they pay 4% on top of the 8%. They pay 4% of the city's cost, of the employer's cost, in addition to their own 8%. With the GFFA, they pay 4%. With the GPOA, they will come to pay 3.5%. Or I'm sorry, the classic employees, those that were hired before PEPRA came into effect in 2012-13, they pay 4%. So people say, well, 4%, what's 4%? I would submit to you that if somebody said we're going to increase your Social Security withholding by 4%, you would notice, and I think our employees certainly do that. But I will tell you, across all of our ranks, the managers in GMA, the executives leading by example, our public safety associations are all either at 4% or the PEPRA employees, those who are hired under a less expensive promise, they pay 3.5%. And even IBEW, the one unit that you did have to unilaterally implement upon, they pay 3% of the employer's share for their retirement cost on top of their employee share.
So we all know, and we all agree that the PERS system is screwed up, that they're playing doubling up to catch up. But the critics of Glendale, and you know who you are out there, cannot criticize this city council and the city workforce for not doing everything we can to reduce the burden on the general fund and on our taxpayers. There's hardly any other cities in the entire state of California that have this much cooperation and have worked together with the city unions to get these concessions from them.
That's a true statement. I would even submit to you that the hallmark, I think, of the city council, past and presumably and hopefully present, is honesty, intellectual honesty. because you know what the PERS burden is. You know you're not getting out of PERS. We've run those scenarios in the past. I think even the most hardened critics would tell you that you're not getting out of PERS if they're going to be honest about it. I would tell you that when you look at the other elements of our compensation strategy, to the extent that we are in the service business, we don't make widgets, we provide service, so the primary cost that we have is in people, particularly in the general fund. And to that end, you have to recruit people. Keep in mind that 2/3 of the general fund in any full-service city is going to be public safety. If you're going to keep police officers, firefighters, paramedics, particularly paramedics and police officers, you are going to have to be competitive in the marketplace. Now, this city council has adopted, at least for the 5 years I've been here, a compensation mantra that states that you will pay the average and expect exceptional customer service from your employees. That juxtaposed to what you see happening in other cities that have a different tax base, that have different economic pressures upon them. We are maintaining and struggling for a qualified, expert, professional workforce dedicated to public service, and at the same time holding true to this we pay average mantra, which in the good years for us is a benefit because it makes sure that we aren't in that free agency, if you think about it, this in baseball terms, the spiraling impact of free agency, where one gives a raise, then this one gives a raise because they are guaranteed to be #1 of their survey or guaranteed to be in the 80th percentile or 90th percentile. We are hovering right at the middle. You are working steadfast to keep those employees yet make good on that promise. At the same time, expecting them to pay the employee share as well as a portion of the employer's share. That doesn't happen necessarily in other cities. So you're struggling, as you say, kind of trying to pay it back doubly, keep good employees, keep exceptional employees, and realize that we are not going to pay you more than the Santa Monicas of the world, more than sometimes the Pasadenas or Burbanks of the world, other people that are in the marketplace, people that we compete with talent for. That ultimately is a reflection of city council. Because not only are you balancing pressures of the market, pressures of PERS, but you're also balancing pressures of what our tax base is. Glendale, as you know, and you'll see in slides when we talk about our sales tax and property tax, we have, for 32 square miles, we have a tremendous amount of area that is unbuildable. We have 3 mountain ranges in town. We have 4 freeways in town. 80%, I believe, more than 80% of our usable land area is residential. Single-family residential in the central part and further into the north, and multifamily in the central to the south. The point being that when you look at our sales tax, we're talking about downtown, we're talking about the Galleria and Americana, and Brand Boulevard of cars. So juxtaposed to the reality of we aren't going to change what our land use mix is for the most part, juxtaposed to the reality that PERS is what it is, juxtaposed to the reality that we have the idea that we have to live within our means, the council has held good faith. And I think the employees have held good faith to say, we want to be in Glendale. We want to provide service to this community. And I think it's very well represented by your comments. Again, this notion of intellectual honesty. There are variables that you can't change, and so you strive to maximize the value of what you can. And sometimes that equation is not easy, and it certainly isn't easy in a slide like this or in the numbers that you quoted.
Thank you.
So as I say, we are trying, our goal is to keep the far right column, general fund percentage net of cost share, below 20%. Why 20%? Because when you look at organizations that find themselves crowding out, is the term that often gets used, crowding out funding for services that our residents depend on. They are in that 25, 30% range of their general fund is going to pay for pensions, basically paying for service, both for people that are here in the operation, but increasingly by way of the UAL, people that no longer even work here. So we are trying to identify strategies that will help us keep that number below 20%, and ideally we'd be hovering down around 11, 12%, as historically we had been. One of those strategies, all things considered, is the establishment of this PERS trust fund. What we would do effectively is taking stock of the fact that the city treasurer, Rafi Manoukian, has done a yeoman's job of maximizing the portfolio returns that we have. I think he's pushed it to 1.2%, where before it hovered around 80 basis points, 75 basis points. That is about the limit of what the market will allow and what the charter allows Mr. Manoukian, Treasurer Manoukian, to invest in. So we can either hold these dollars in the reserve earning $1.2 million, or we can take money, set it aside in a longer term investment, hoping and expecting to, through the laws of investment returns, be able to grow that money to establish a higher investment return. And we are looking hopefully for 5%. And I think that's key because, as I mentioned earlier, PERS has not been realizing their 7.5%. In fact, they're dropping that number down. Even the strategies that we're identifying aim at a higher than 5% return on investment. Again, trying to be as conservative as we possibly can, we are focusing on a 5% rate of return. And if we're able to keep the dollars in this investment portfolio for a longer period of time and in instruments that are prohibited, that city treasurer is prohibited from investing in, we think that we can take what amounts to $35 million in one-time monies and grow that over a period of time that will shave off the peaks of those PERS rates that we know are coming in out years. This allows us to stabilize that rate in the next decade. We will show you in just a bit how we would expect to maximize the value of this PERS stabilization trust fund and explain what it is and what it is not. The idea for us is that, and some folks have claimed, that this is a PERS trust fund and thus it can only be used for PERS, and thus you're squirreling this money away expressly for the benefit of employees, for better or for worse. That's what you are doing. I would submit to you that that's not necessarily an incorrect statement, but it certainly is an incomplete statement because, as we have explained in the past, the PERS trust fund allows these dollars at any time without penalty to be used for PERS costs. As we have shown what our PERS costs are, you effectively could liquidate this trust fund in the space of 1 year, and those dollars that you would otherwise use to pay that PERS cost in any given year could then be backed out to whatever priority the city council might have. God forbid there was some kind of natural emergency.
That was going to be my point. We could withdraw from that trust fund in case of emergencies. It doesn't have to be for PERS exactly.
From the trust fund has to be for PERS, but the money that you would otherwise use to pay PERS,
Right, is
you let that accrue back to the general fund for this council to make policy as you see fit. So as I say, the statement, the objection that we have heard probably most vociferously is not necessarily incorrect, but I would argue that it is incomplete. Yes, sir.
I mean, Mr. Ochoa, isn't this some scheme to protect the salaries when the city declares bankruptcy? Isn't that what trusts are all about? Irrevocable trusts? Come on now. We've heard from bankruptcy attorneys that creating an irrevocable trust is a manner to protect assets in the event of bankruptcy. And the only reason, one reason that we're accused of doing this, proposing this, is in the event that the city goes belly up, maybe from the return of the general fund transfer or whatever, that will preserve, everything else will blow up, but our employees will still have their salaries and pensions, will have their pensions. Isn't that true, Mr. Ochoa?
I would have to say no. And I appreciate the prosecutorial tone, most certainly.
No, because that's what we hear. I mean, it's a legitimate
Yes, sir.
discussion that the community has brought forward, and I don't believe it's true, but clearly there's a lot more that we're doing with this. I mean, the point of this and the intent is to obtain a greater percentage of return on otherwise idle money than we would otherwise be receiving through our yeoman, Mr. Manoukian, with his limited range of investments that he can make. And in the event that we want to immediately put this back into PERS, we can do that, and we'd use it up in the space of about a year or so.
And I think that I think is the proof in the pudding, and as it were, because you would be putting $35 million into this trust, perhaps. Could put less, could put more, but we're using 35 for the model. That is not entirely the city's one-year obligation to PERS. And so if the idea was to sit back and twist our mustaches by way of keeping this money as some asset, that asset couldn't cover 1 year's worth of expense. The purpose of the asset isn't to cover an entire PERS cost. It's merely to shave off the peaks of those rates that we'll show you in a second, because if we're able to do that, that frees up money in future years in the general fund that instead of going to PERS, which you know that obligation is there and you're not going to get out of, instead of sending that money to PERS, you're able to spend that money on parks, on libraries, on firefighters, and police officers. You know that there is a storm cloud on the horizon. What we're recommending you do is put money away, let it accrue compounded interest, and then draw it down when it starts to rain. At the end of the day, that's all this endeavor is. Yes.
One more question. This obligation is for how long that you will put the money aside?
That is a great question. We would like to hold it in trust for 8 years. That presumes that there is discipline on the council and that there is not some crisis that would require you to liquidate the trust and back out the dollars. But ideally, we would hold on to it and not draw down, I believe, until 2024. And then make small measured drawdowns that will show you how they track with the upcoming rate structure or the rates that the actuary has provided. This gives you an idea here in terms of the comparison to Mr. Najarian's point. Money that we would put into the general fund investment pool with the shackles, if you will, that the city treasurer has in terms of how long he can invest in and what he can invest in on the right-hand side, as opposed to what we would be able to realize by way of the Section 115 trust. Again, earning a 5% rate of return, not 7 or 7.5 or even 6. So we are being as conservative as can be, but you see that being able to put money into investments for a longer period of time does generate a significantly greater return, even at moderate risk levels. Oh, yes, sir.
I ask you, so what makes you so sure that we will collect 5% return, and what happens if you don't get 5% return?
If we, what makes us confident is the historical performance of the partner that we would look to sign up with in Highmark, and we'll show you a comparison in just a few slides. But even in down market periods, being in the most significant down market period in our lifetime, certainly up until now, being able to generate some rate of return. And if they don't hit the rate of return, if it's something less than 5%, you have still options as policymakers. You can change the investment profile to go more aggressive, or you can pull back to be less aggressive, or pull out of the investment altogether, out of the trust, by way of the liquidation of the trust, as explained by Councilmember Devine. So it is an investment. There is risk no matter what, but I would submit to you that there's risk stepping off the curb as you walk down the street. The idea here is that when you look at historical performance at conservative levels, you're able to still realize more significant rate of return than if you just leave it in the city's treasury and earn 1.2%.
So if we look at that graph which you have on the screen, so on the left side, the blue one is not guaranteed. The right side, although it's a minimum or generating very low return, is safe.
Safer, certainly, sure. Because Mr. Manukian does, his portfolio is predicated on safety, liquidity, and yield. So there is and it's a reflection of what the return is, 1.5%. Certainly you can do that. Certainly the council can keep money in that account, but I would submit to you that there is a tremendous opportunity cost juxtaposed to the obligations that we know are out there.
And also one more question is, I just want to make sure that if we see that at a later time, 2 years down the road, this does not work, we can stop it altogether?
You would liquidate the trust and pay current contemporary PERS costs, right? And then take money that you would have otherwise taken from the general fund to pay PERS and put that back into the treasury.
Okay.
And another question, Mr. Mayor. We will be getting reports on a regular basis on how the fund is doing so that we can keep an eye on it. And if we see something like this going on, then we can always take action as a council.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Mayor,
Yes, Councilmember.
is there any,
Sorry.
is there any dispute as to this? Would Mr. Manukian, our treasurer, like to confirm this? Hi, Mr. Manukian. Don't mean to call you out.
Surely.
But listen, so here's the thing. Can we get, I mean, the question is the 5% an unrealistic projection for what we could get in that fund?
Based on the portfolio that you have and based on the policy that you have adopted, the 5% is certainly not reachable, is not realistic for a 5-year investment. Today's rates for 5% for treasuries for 5 years, it's approximately 190 basis points for 5 years. If you want to earn more than what you're earning currently, you have to go longer and you have to go for corporate paper as opposed to treasuries and agencies, where you will be reducing the safety that you're looking for the funds, for the taxpayer funds. So everything is a function of risk and the term of the paper that you're purchasing. How much risk do you want to take on, and how long do you want to take it on for? That's the bottom line.
So you don't believe that we will get that 5%? Did I?
Well, I haven't studied exactly what they
Oh.
invest in, but if historically they have been getting 5%, I'm pretty confident that they will continue to do so.
Oh.
Unless something extraordinary happens, and in that case, we're all in trouble. So,
To Councilmember Devine's earlier question, I think the governing, or at least administrative advisory group to this council as you make policy would be similar to the investment committee that is chaired by Mr. Manukian, which includes the director of finance as well as the assistant city manager's office, or assistant city manager. So there is a multiple eyes that look at the operations, that look at the investments, and of course, as Councilmember Devine indicates, we'd be reporting that back to you on a regular basis, much the same way that Mr. Manukian produces his quarterly update on the overall city portfolio.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to move on with the presentation. This item will be coming back to us to be discussed extendedly, and this is basically a Plan B for 2024. And meanwhile, we are going to have a Plan A as to how are we going to manage our finances until that time. So,
Yes, we would ask, as we move to this presentation, for council to say, pursue this and bring it back to you at a later date, or stop pursuing this and stop spinning the wheels on this. Because at this point, there are a number of members of the finance department that are engaged trying to keep the numbers current. But if that's not what council's policy is, then I would just as soon move away from the strategy and try to invest in our time in something else.
Is next year's budget contingent upon us giving you instruction one way or another?
Well, it is the financial picture that you will see. It does have an impact for this, and you'll look at the 5-year financial forecast. That is impacted by whether or not you just keep money in the treasury or you do something with that money. So yes and no.
I think if I understand this correctly, I mean, I don't know that council is ready to say pursue it or don't pursue it. I mean, maybe we're ready to say bring this back and let's look at it again. But in
I think
terms
that's-
of giving you specific instruction whether we want to move forward with it or not, I think it's just too premature.
Well, I think that's what we're looking for. If you were just telling us we aren't interested in this because it was deadlocked 2-2 last time, then we would just stop looking at it. If you say, well, bring it back to us, we still would like to consider it at a later date, that's important to know.
I think, if I may, if my colleagues will indulge me, I think one of the primary reasons, or at least a significant contributing reason why we were apprehensive about moving forward with this last time it was brought to council was the uncertainty with the GFT litigation, and we had some date certains coming up, such as other litigation, related litigation that may have a ruling coming down that's going to bear on our own situation. So perhaps we can, again, maybe bring it back, but at a time when we have some certainty as to what's going on.
That's
with
entirely the
GFT.
council's prerogative. I would just tell you that establishing the trust isn't something that can't be undone, as we've discussed. But what cannot be realized without additional funding from the city would be the lost opportunity cost of delaying the initiation of the trust, if that makes sense. And so, again, I just want to give you the complete context so that you can give us that direction, because ultimately, as I say, if you say, don't bring, if the council's direction is bring this back to us at mid-year budget for 17-18, then we'll bring it back to you mid-year 17-18, understanding that there is a cost to doing that.
Is the city attorney here? Oh, I'm sorry. You're hiding behind Mr. Nigerian. So when is the Redlands case supposed to come down?
What was the question? Sorry, what was it?
The question is, when is the ruling from the California Supreme Court on the Redlands case supposed to...
Councilmember Sanani, City Reading case
Reading.
has been fully briefed, but the court has not set oral argument. Once they do, then the court has 90 days to issue a ruling once they have oral argument. And it's anticipated, if starting from today, the earliest it could happen is probably 6 months from now, oral argument. So you're talking probably at the end of the year when you're looking at a decision.
Okay.
But what I understand the concerns, but let's say things go bad. Let's say we invest, the worst case situation would be we invest in this fund and the Redlands case goes against us. In which case, those funds can be used immediately for our PERS contribution for that year.
Yes.
So it's not like we're going to say, oh, why did we invest in this fund? We're stuck now. We've got an extra hole to fill. We'll just start drawing from the trust fund.
That's correct.
From the stabilization fund.
I think just in sheer numbers, every month we delay putting that 24 million in costs us about 75,000 in that incremental interest that we could earn. So, I mean, even if we put it in and decided 6 months from now we wanted to pull that cash out, we would be that much better off. So you have 75,000 times 6 months, or approximately whatever the
But we wouldn't be able to
450,000.
pull the cash out, right? We would be
Yeah,
able
you
to
can.
use that money towards...
You can pull it out for PERS, and then we take our,
Yeah, you
whatever we're going to
backfill it.
spend to PERS and use that. So we're just
Right.
taking it out of here, kind of rotating and substituting it. But I don't, as Scott said, I don't think there's any downside of setting up the trust and then funding it and then earning that higher rate of return.
I want to understand one more question is, so the investment which you're going to do will be for a certain amount of time, right? You're not, tomorrow, like a year later, you can't pull out of the investment. It's just
Yes, we
the
can.
benefit of it, where we're going to use will be different, like to use for this lawsuit, or we will use for PERS.
Through this engagement, the city would engage Highmark Capital as the professional investment manager. They have pooled, I think, 77 cities now use this trust fund.
As opposed to the 29 or so that we had when we first brought the
Cities
concept.
are doing this in rather rapidly, because it is exactly what we can do, is get that extra incremental interest through this trust. So they create these portfolios, and we just don't. It's like a mutual fund, for lack of a better description. We get a piece of that moderate portfolio. They reinvest it, rebalance it. They've been hitting, I think, recently over 7% return. The expected return is about 5%. And if you look at the incremental return, just what I just calculated, that 3.5%, so 1.5%, assuming the Treasury earns, roughly makes 1.5%, to that 5% is about 75,000 a month for that 24 million. And as we ramp it up to 35, it would be even more.
No, but it's again my question, maybe I missed it. You are investing for fixed certain period of time.
No, they're rebalancing that portfolio.
From day one, they will pay you at least 5%.
Well, there's no guarantee. The portfolio is targeted to return 5%. They're currently making about 7.
Nice.
So we put that money in there, it makes 5 to 7%. If the market goes down, we could
You're
earn
not
3%.
committing yourself to.
There's no fixed term for this, and we can pull it out at any time.
Thank you.
If I may, it seems like this, to me, the analogy to this is a college fund that parents set up, except we can take the money out without penalties at any time. Period.
Right, because you're going to use it on those purposes for which
Correct.
it was intended, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Why don't we take an informal poll on this? Because if there's 3 votes, then we know where we're going. If there's not, then we know to move on, I guess.
Or can we just maybe ask for it to, I don't want to do anything that's premature, but just, I would be interested in moving forward with this, and for staff to come back with a more detailed, I guess, report on this.
That's what I was referring to in the beginning. I said this item could come back to us in a day that we have a lighter agenda, so we can discuss this extensively and make an educated decision, because we don't have all the information today.
But this is I want council to know, this is a very good forum in which to discuss this. In a workshop, budget workshop, where there's this sort of give and take, and, call up the staff and the treasurer and all that. Last time we discussed this, we were a little bit constrained. I mean, it was in the setting of a formal city council meeting. But I mean, if now is the time, I think. This isn't a new issue. This has been out there for how long? 5 months we've been talking about this? 4 months?
Let me start asking questions about what are we going to do from today until 2022 and 23. Our PERS cost is going to increase from $50 million to $77 million. This fund, the trust fund that we're going to establish, is going to be, we're going to draw down from 2024. So by 2024, I don't have that number. I'm sure the PERS cost will be another $3 million on top of that. So it will be $80 million at that time versus $50 million today. With this trust fund, we can start drawing down about $3 to $4 million a year in a 10 years period. So draw down the whole thing, or $4 or $5 million a year to help shave off the top.
Right.
But what are we going to do? That's my question. I mean, this is one thing, but what is the plan, or our plan A, basically, from today until fiscal year 22, 23, which this PERS cost is going to be $80 million.
Yeah.
And that's the question. I know we can assume that our income is going to go up overall by another $20, $30 million. These are all based on assumptions. What if it doesn't go? That's what I was a little bit hesitant in the beginning, because of the risk of these trust accounts. I mean, you can't guarantee anything. It's 5 to 7% today. It may be 2% tomorrow. PERS did the same thing. They said it's super funded, and it went down the drain. So I'm not trying to paint this doomsday picture, but we have to be very careful, because if we lose that money, you can't even use it for PERS costs. So that's my.
Yes, no, I appreciate the comment, because the council has been very diligent in saying, okay, give me options. So option 1 would be pay-as-you-go. And the pay-as-you-go is probably represented by the calculations you did and the actuarial rates that you see up here. Option 2 could be try to prepay PERS. Problem with prepaying PERS, if you took this money and you gave it to PERS and say, okay, does that start to eat away at that $400 million actuarial liability? If PERS has another bad year, it's like that money it just vaporizes, right? That's why I think most investment managers and actuaries would tell you, hold on to the money yourself while PERS figures out what PERS is going to do. Option 3, we've looked at being a pension obligation bond, which is very similar to the first option, by way of we'll take on a long-term debt, get a nice big chunk of money, give that over to PERS to buy down that actuarial liability. But even there, again, it's no guarantee that PERS is going to maximize their investments and be able to hit whatever numbers that they're putting out in front of you. which leads us back to this number of saying, okay, take fate into your own hands to say you have one-time money, not operational monies, and put that aside for this obligation that you know is coming. As I say, the PERS rates that you see the safety rates across the top. What we're trying to do is just like you described, sir. The mayor had outlined, you were trying to shave off that PERS cost. And so you see where the numbers start to crest there going into 23, 24, 25, and then start to level off in 32, 33, 34, and before Pepper really kicks in, the demographic profile of the retired annuitants kicks in, and then you see that steep drop off in 2040s. And
I'm sorry, one more question. When you say it starts leveling off or tapering off or is going down, is based on the calculation that some of our employees will get old and expire, but my understanding was that they can take a little bit less money today and transfer that to their spouses or even their children.
This takes into account all those promises.
It does.
It does take into account all of those promises. The kind of the baby boomer group that is moving through into retirement at this point in time. And as you say, the demographic profile, they will expire at some point, and most dramatically, PEPRA finally kicks in. The Pension Reform Act finally kicks in, and all those folks that are reaching a much reduced promise versus what was for the classic members, that kicks in at about the same time. And so you see that steep drop off, and it's just a curve that makes its way down. Our goal then is to figure out what do we do between 23 and 33, that 10-year period. And that, at the end of the day, is what we're trying to do. A total value of about $62 million. So we certainly can, there's information here about what the needed actions would be. There's information here about what it does to our reserve levels. What I hear council saying is that, I haven't heard take this away and never bring it back. I'm hearing I still have concerns about the timing of this. So if that's the case, we can continue to brief, we can continue to bring you information, knowing that the real cutoff date for this discussion really is June 6th, when the budget gets adopted. So we have what amounts to third quarter adjustments here today, but we would carry those to the end of the fiscal year. And if council said, yes, we want to make this move, we would take the money from last year, take the money from this current fiscal year, and move it into the trust. If not, then it'll stay in the general fund reserve with Mr. Manukian.
Can we do that? Like, let's say this council decided in July 15th to make this move. We can do that at that time as well, right?
You can do it
Doesn't
at any
have
time.
to
Yeah,
be-
on the quarter. It gets implemented on the quarter.
So, if I may,
Councilman Sinani.
it seems like from looking at the graphs, the PERS rates escalate. I mean, they start escalating less, but they nevertheless escalate all the way up into the early 30s, right?
Yes, sir.
Fiscal year. And they don't really taper off until the 40s. And I'm going back to the mayor's question. Okay, so this investment is sort of a side issue. It helps us shave off, a few $1 million every year. But how are we going to confront that fundamental, 50% increase, 55% increase by year 22, 23? I'm not sure I heard an answer.
No, the answer is you aren't. The answer, let's be very, very clear. The answer is unless you somehow pull out of PERS, which will cost you billions more, you aren't going to do that. So unless you do that, unless the federal government were to come and ride to the rescue of PERS and 40 other pension systems around the country, what we have is what we can count on. Right. And so the idea that the cavalry's coming ain't going to be the case. We are the cavalry. And so it's either pay as you go, and you see this is what pay as you go looks like, or it is try to pre-fund PERS. The problem with pre-funding PERS is that if they have a bad cycle, it's like you never pre-funded them in the first place. So to the extent that council has directed, give us something that we can be in charge of. Give us something that we can take our fate in our own hands. This and possibly a pension obligation bond could be the thing, but on a pension obligation bond, you're paying interest in order to realize one-time monies that you would set aside. Glendale, because of its fiscal responsibility, doesn't need to float a pension bond to get that one-time money. You have the one-time money if you want to use it.
Okay,
I think to answer your question is, recall we always use that 5-year forecast. And we manage to that 5-year forecast. So as our recurring costs, which include PERS, go up, we are managing to that cost. So while we project out what our revenues are going up, we're tapering those costs, which include PERS, so we don't have huge deficits as you look out on the forecast.
so I guess that's
So-
a good way to put it. Are our revenues going to be commensurate to these increases? Again, this investment that we're talking about seems like an aid. It's just a way to ease the pain, but the pain is still going to be there.
Absolutely.
There's no cavalry coming. No
Absolutely.
one's coming to our aid. No one's under that illusion. The question is, how are we going to deal with that pain when it comes? Are we projecting the revenues to increase in a commensurate manner?
So we're projecting those based off the trend lines of which we have in terms of revenues. And then as you look at that forecast,
Skipping ahead to the 5-year forecast.
we build in, and that's why we isolate out the PERS and the PERS cost sharing and to see what that burden is as we move forward. So we can adjust our appropriations to where we have a balanced budget, including those increased PERS costs.
So as you
and
look
that's exactly
across-
why we use a 5-year horizon.
If you look across, and that's right, it's a constantly a rolling 5-year horizon. So this looks very familiar to council. We show it to you. These last 5 years, we've shown you this every quarter. And you see kind of what the numbers are, and you've seen the down years, and you've seen the up years. When you look at right in the middle of the slide there, net surplus or deficit, you'll see that on a $215 million budget, 207 in the current year, and then 214 going into fiscal year 2017, $215 million effectively, $500,000 deficit is effectively a rounding error. And so you look at what our resources are across the top. That is when you look, I think you can say very confidently, we are conservative in our revenue estimates, but we do not sandbag them. Our goal is not to under-promise and over-deliver. Our goal is to give you our best thought as to what is going to happen with sales tax, property tax, utility user tax, and all the other revenue streams into the general fund. And I think you see that every quarter when we come back to you with revenue adjustments. And sometimes we downgrade revenues as Armin does his projections. A lot of times, usually, we're holding firm or increasing what our ongoing revenues are. So you see along that bottom, 6.5 is the third quarter adjustment, or is the projected third quarter right now, right? For the current fiscal year at third quarter, as I mentioned, we were looking at the $6.5 million, less out $4 million to CIP investments, and then a deposit into a stabilization fund. When you look at next year, we are $500,000 out of whack. When you look at the coming year, $7 million up, $2.4 million up, $3.5 million up. And when you look to 21, 22, and things do start to get a little bit fuzzy, we also know that's when we'll be dropping in new revenues by way of some of the businesses that council has brought into town, by way of new hotels, by way of new retail. So we don't want to, again, being very conservative, we don't want to count those chickens before they hatch, but those operations should be open and operating by the time we get to 21, 22. We feel very confident that 21, 22 is going to be balanced. Not fat, not a lot of money for us to really invest in new operations, but we're riding that wave, staying even with where we need to be. As you see here along the very bottom, that is if you were to do the trust, because those would be one-time withdrawals from the general fund reserve. And you see it really doesn't change our picture really very much at all. And again, I think that goes back to the city council. You have told us, as Bob said, manage to the horizon, look where we're going, make sure that we get there. And so we are very competitive about coming in on budget or under budget. And we do things like SIP, or we do things like gain share to incentivize everybody on the team to move in that direction. And I think it's reflected here.
If I can ask, in terms of getting a historic sense or historic perspective as to what the overall trajectory is for the city and its city's financial health. So let's say in better times, whatever that means, I don't know, 60s to 80s were those better times, Mr. Elliott?
90s would be the best.
Probably mid-90s.
But those are really exceptional, right? And they're aberrations because they This whole,
Early 2000s, I mean, you see the cycles, yeah? But yes.
so has the city's budget always been sort of hand to mouth? You know, we're balanced, we're good, maybe a little deficit, maybe a little surplus, but nothing extraordinary? Or has historically the city always had surpluses?
The city has been very conservative. So I would say that you've had surpluses, and in fact, Glendale for a long time was kind of a wealthy city.
Wealthy?
A wealthy city. When you think of in the 80s and into the 90s, the amount of land that was purchased for cash by the city, straight out of the general fund reserves, it tells you, kind of the story of the city council. At this point, you're in a position where you have a lot of overhead. We have a lot of parks. We have a lot of facilities. We have a staff that is probably stretched about as thin as you can stretch it. And so we are somewhat riding, kind of hand to mouth for the time being. But I will submit to you that by the time you get to that drop off in those PERS rates, at that point would be a return to a golden age, because our costs, those PERS costs, which will be so significant, will start to fall off.
But that's 2040s.
Well, that's in 2040, but the idea being that it was, if you say that in the 1960s and 70s and into the 1980s and late 80s even, the city was putting half of its sales tax into CIP. And then it was, less and less and less. When I got here, we weren't putting any sales tax into CIP. Now we've been able to do that. There's been an evolution for this community, but there's been an evolution for communities all across the state. And so the idea being that you are blessed, and as am I, as everyone here, to be in an organization that was sound enough, that was conservative enough, such that when the Great Recession did come, we're still on our feet. And we're able to pivot and go in these other directions. You're putting $16 million into parks. I mean, yes, it's coming from development impact fees, but the point being that people want to invest here. You're seeing your property tax and sales tax and all of your other taxes, especially occupancy tax, going up because this is a dynamic, vibrant place, all because of what you guys have said, go get me this thing. You've also told us, go manage to a 5-year horizon and make sure we stay positive. And if it came back that the numbers in 2022, in the coming years, you get to 2022 and those numbers are down and they go down. What you know is that we have done it before. You have negotiated with your employees to claw back benefits from them. You absolutely have, and I think your union contracts are reflective of that. You know that you have the ability and the stomach to go and reduce workforce, because it wasn't that long ago we had 2,000 people on the payroll, and now we're about 1,584 according to the proposed budget. So all the things, there's a solemn pride from this council's part to say, I can live based on my projections, because if things go bad, I can fix it, because you have fixed it. And if things go good, well, you try to be conservative. You're going to take your money off the table and want to do something else with it rather than just letting it ride. And that's kind of what we're reflecting here on the going forward with the forecast.
So, Chair, I have a question regarding the PERS cost again. On slide 12, it says, I'm just going to pick a year 2021. It says citywide cost, normal plus UAL, is 70 million. And on slide 28, the one that we were just showing, it says net PERS 43.4. 28.
Right, this is general fund, just the general fund. What you're seeing is
that was
all
citywide,
funds,
yeah.
all budgets.
This is just general.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's police and fire.
Yes, well, and libraries, parks, those are the 4 largest departments in the general fund.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Okay, with that direction then, we'll accelerate through into the coming year's budget. I do want to share with you, this had come up from the mayor as well, show us what the overall pooled cash is, because we've heard discussions in the past about there's only $80 million that the city has in its portfolio. That's, again, I think there's some confusion. That smaller chunk of money was what is in the general fund reserve. What is in all of your pooled cash is the You see along the bottom, Mr. Manukian has $665 million in the city's portfolio. The entire amount of cash, almost $741 million, but that takes into account everything that we have by way of bond cash, as well as some restricted accounts that aren't in Mr. Manukian's portfolio. So $741 million, more or less, that you have within the operation. The key takeaways here, we are very proud of the fact that when you look at the electric fund, which was down to $60 million, it no longer is in the poor shape. They were down to $60 million, losing $20 million a year. That has been reversed. Water fund was $20 million negative. They are at an operating reserve of combined of the operating cash and the operating reserve, nearly $15 million. And I think I'm very confident in telling you now, with Mr. Zern sitting in the audience, that when we present to you next year's cost of service analyses for the upcoming rate plans for water and electric, that you will see, as you had requested when we first did the rate plans, no longer the 87522 or the 4444 rate plans, but zeros and ones and maybe even a 2 just to keep up with CPI, because you took the hard medicine. Again, that notion of solemn pride, you did the hard stuff in order to get to a point where we could live even beyond the hand to mouth. So let's talk very quickly about the proposed budget. If I can have all the, I never do this, and so I need to do this. I'm sorry?
Did we come to a decision on that?
I think we're going to bring this information back to you as part of the upcoming budget.
Right, okay.
So, and allow council to take that.
If there's any other info that we need, I mean, if we want to see history on the returns, the qualifications, any external fees involved when we pull our money out, I mean, let's get that now, because I'd like to make a decision on this. Time is ticking, and there's a lot of interest at stake every month that we let it go. So either now or behind and off the
had
dais
planned
or whatever.
We had planned to present this and then bring it back during budget adoption for a formal decision, if that works, and we can spend more time at that point in time, or during the hearing, I guess, if that works.
Yeah, that'll work.
So we will push through. I always miss this part, and so if I can have the budget team stand up, everyone who's one of the budget team and finance, and or one of the liaisons. I don't think any of the liaisons from other departments are. These are the folks that actually begin at last year. Okay, now you can sit down. I don't want to spoil them. Along with Audrey and Armin, are the people that actually put together what is, when you consider all the carryovers, all the projects, more than $1 billion a year for you to consider and make policy decisions on. We track information going back to last year, and the budget process in earnest begins in January, where Audrey, who is just become almost like a nun in a Catholic school, just rapping people's knuckles, saying that thou shalt get me my budget modules closed by certain times, has this down to a science. And my point is that the overall timeline, what you see here, even though this is just a workshop, begins months and months and months in advance, and involves not just the people that are here in the audience, but also the departments, from the department directors to their operational managers to the budget liaisons in each one of our line departments. They do a tremendous job. And so the modules that are closed, the logs that are created, everything that we have here today by way of summary, this dashboard that we provide to you today, next Tuesday, the Tuesday afterwards, is backed up by, I would say, reams of paper, but we don't even do that anymore. It's the spreadsheets that we have all on the network, down to the final penny. So certainly these folks are to be commended, and I just want you to know that there's a tremendous amount of work that goes on to that. As you saw in the 5-year financial forecast, or was alluded to, our starting revenue estimate, $206 million. With the total resources, when you look at a couple of items, adjustments that Armin has brought forth based on his meetings with all of our consultants, with all of our analysts, we are looking at a net adjustment in revenue of a little over $7 million. We are moving out use of assigned economic development fund balance. You recall that we moved money into the general fund by way of economic development, and we would pull out small chunks, in this case $905,000, which is part of Phil Lanzafame's strategy, if you recall, from a couple of years ago, to use economic development funds to have the resources to hire back hourly inspectors, plan checkers, and other people in the building and safety department, such that we could get through the glut of work that is moving through his department. So the idea being that we saw actually handling folks' business as economic development, be they homeowners or large developers. The other item that you see here, $525,000, is something that we would like to present to the council in the coming year's budget, and that is the augmentation and the restoration of the internal audit function to its own separate department, augmented by an investment to the tune of $525,000 in innovation and performance management, continuous improvement. So the total resources here would be almost $215 million for the general fund. We're expecting, again, very conservatively, that the overall resources will grow by almost 1% in the general fund, backed up by 2.2% increase in property tax, a little over 4% sales tax. TOT is a function of the new hotels that have come on, or a new hotel that is in place, and we are counting a portion of the, I can never remember the name of the hotel. Hyatt. The tail end of the Hyatt. And then we start to parachute in future years of revenues other hotel projects that are underway in the downtown. And so you'll see in this current year both the increase in TOT that was approved by the voters a couple years ago, as well as the increase in market contribute to that 17% increase. We've been pleasantly surprised with just how many people are continuing to come to Glendale to do business, staying in our hotels. Utility user taxes up, permits licenses are basically flat.
Hold
So,
on. What's the, I'm sorry. Look.
I think with the Olympics of 2020 being around the corner and the bid that City of LA is putting in, I don't know if they got the bid or not, but if they get that, we need more hotels in Glendale. And I think we need to accommodate some of these higher-end hotels that have good quality hotels. I'm not talking about inns anymore, to bring maybe 2 or 3 more hotels. So they each pay average between $800,000 to $1 million. If you have 3 or 4 or 5 new hotels, that's $5 million a year. In 30 years, that's $150 million. I think that's another way of shaving off the top
Absolutely.
of that PERS rates by increasing our revenues.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Councilmember Alejandro, go ahead, please.
Utility users tax of 3.5%. What you mean by changes?
The revenue that we
growth of the
realize,
revenue.
the rates don't change, just the amount of revenue by way of usage is
all right,
increasing. So, the EMS fund, if you'll see a pop in revenue by way of us collapsing the emergency medical response fund into the general fund, but rest assured that that is almost entirely eaten up by the program costs. So it isn't just new money that's coming in. I would point out, yes, sir.
Very sorry. Aren't we lowering the electricity charges
No.
because of this lawsuit?
No.
They're not going back?
We have appealed the decision, so nothing has changed
If
yet.
you don't win.
If we don't win, but we would recommend to you, we'll show you a little bit of what the revenue looks like then, if that does come to pass. But for purposes of this budget, and until the appeal is exhausted, we're moving forward with basically on a straight line.
But if we lose, it's not going to be increased by 3.5%, right?
Well, I think the whole point of the lawsuit is that you can only charge that cost, so we couldn't artificially increase or inflate rates.
Okay.
Right? The general fund transfer is at 10%. You recall it used to be, I think, close to 14% of revenues. We began drawing that down such that by about $250,000 a year as a revenue increase, revenue increase, so that it would equalize at 10%, lock in at 10% of revenues, and then let it float there going forward. So we are pleased that this is the second year of that occurrence. When you look at all the proposed appropriations, as the 16-17 budget, you saw we started at $94.7 million. We had adjustments of $15 million. The M&O increases of about 5.6, and that gets us to that total of 214, almost 215 million for the coming year. So just incremental increases on top of what we've had here. So what is that? What are those incremental increases? What do they consist of? When you look at the net PERS cost, that's net of the employee cost share, that increases $5 million compared to last year. As I mentioned earlier, the EMS revenue is being collapsed into the general fund, but it's also being netted out by way of costs. So there will no longer be a Fund 511 that'll all be collapsed in the general fund. In terms of $2.3 million for service level adjustments, that'll be a net 3 positions. So creation of 5 positions, elimination of 2 positions for a net increase of 3. And that will be across those departments of fire, police, and what we're calling innovation, performance, and audit, IPA. There's about $500,000 in police overtime to stem what we see is the ongoing impact of AB 103 and Prop 47, and the need to keep more officers on the street, especially as we work through some of our IOD issues. We are having good success with our third-party administrator as that sets the tone for our other workers' comp administrators and adjusters to get folks back to work as quickly as we can. We reallocated 15 positions throughout various departments, the large majority of which are non-management positions. And we are increasing hourly wages. You'll recall that last year we required departments to, the increases to hourly workers was approved, but we did not give departments more money to make those increases. Now we are holding harmless those departments by increasing their budget for hourlies. In terms of other salaries and benefits, as you might suspect, workers' comp is up a little bit. Overall insurance rates were flat, but workers' comp is up, alas. And we do see that there's $805,000 for economic development. I mentioned to you previously that was the $900,000. This is, I believe, year 2 of that strategy. We'll have 1 more year of paying for those hourlies through economic development, and we believe at that point we will have exhausted we kind of characterize it as the snake that ate the deer and it's just kind of digesting through that anaconda. It will have passed by that point. Last but not least, we have the COLAs that were assured already for GFFA, GPOA, and sworn police and fire managers. As I mentioned, also the select city employees, hourly employees. All that is included in that 14 million and change for salaries and benefits. M&O increases, an increase in the ISD service charge. So as departments commence to depreciate certain systems within the various departments, they are charged back through ISD, Information Services Department. As I mentioned, we have the increase in EMS fund, so we brought in revenue, we're taking out cost just to collapse the fund into the general fund overall, more accounting than anything else. We do have some, we'll get into some detail, of actual service level adjustments for M&O accounts. Some will be ongoing, some will be characterized as one-time, and we want to explain that to you so that council can provide their input. The building maintenance fund we would be decreasing, as well as overall small capital furniture and equipment down by $300,000 almost. In terms of transfers and capital outlay, you'll see that $488,000 in decrease of $488,000 in the CIP, and that is a function partially is the $84,000 proposed service level adjustment for the nutritional meals fund. That money is coming in from other sources, and we're being backfilled. What you see, proposed service level adjustments. I mentioned recurring adjustments versus one-time adjustments. So, again, wanting to be as absolutely conservative as possible, we take all of our revenue estimates and do our dead level best to be focused on that which is ongoing. And you can see on the left-hand column, recurring adjustments. The dollars that you see there are matched to what we believe will be ongoing revenues. Even with a heightened conservative view of these revenues, these will be these revenues will be ongoing, and thus we are willing to match costs to them. When you look at one-time adjustments, these are things that departments had requested that would be nice to continue, but we have told departments we're willing to fund it and recommend funding to council for the coming fiscal year. And if revenues hold up, if the revenue stream is what we hope versus what we think, then we can fund you again next year and possibly move them from one-time adjustments to recurring adjustments. But in essence, all of those departments will have to sing for their supper again in the coming year.
Mr. Mayor, if I may interrupt. Mr. Ochoa, so if at some point we decide that we need to augment the city clerk staffing for certain reforms that we impose, are you going to tell us we can't do it because it's not in the budget?
No, what we
I mean,
would.
I think we need to look forward, and I think that's something that, explain to me how that would work. Let's say that we propose to hire a few more FTEs for the city clerk, maybe not on a full-time basis, but significantly during election period. What
Well,
would
if
the
it,
source of those funds?
for a full-time employee, we wouldn't do seasonal folks for full-time. But let's say that as I understood you last night at your comments, to do a study to examine a kind of a post-mortem on the election, and let's say that results in 2 new bodies. But by the time that study is done, it is now September 1. If that is the resultant, if that's the result of the study, and council says we want those 2 new bodies, we would come back to you with the position creation and an appropriation. And for the 17-18 fiscal year, we would say just take it out of fund balance because you have that nice cushion that's there. And in the coming year, you would presumably, if they're full-time equivalent employees, they would be part of city clerk's budget, and it would be baked into the budget already. So by the time you saw it for 18-19, it would already be sewn into the budget. So yeah, adding stuff in mid-year, as you see, we do that pretty regularly, but we do try to discern between that which is ongoing, that which is one time. I will tell you. So when we look at some of those positions, just to give a for instance on the one time versus ongoing. Is it this one? Okay. So the one-time expenditures in CDD, for example, it's the historic. Where are we? I'm sorry, Audrey, help me out.
So let's say in fire, what is that $561,000 for fire?
These are recurring. Here are one time. So in the fire department, one time would be the SCBA program. Expiring the self-contained breathing apparatus, the tubes that they have, to the bottles that they have to breathe, the replacement. The reason why we would put that in one time is because those expire every several years. So if you take that money and you put it in Chief Fish's budget, I'm sure he would find something to do with it by way of equipment and apparatus. But that only comes up every so often. No disrespect to the chief, of course. Sorry, Greg, you're getting roasted soon, so I figured it's fair game. But that would be a true one-time expense, and in 4 years, we probably would come back with another one-time expense. The idea being that we're trying to keep from budget creep. That if we're increasing budgets incrementally, it's too easy, it's too tempting for us. I think just as an organization to insert these small items that ultimately can become big items. Like fire has that for $53,955. Repairs to equipment that we can anticipate, small engine equipment, those are $6,000 and $8,000 respectively. We have recertification training to qualify for the repairs. We have a GIS program that they'd be purchasing for $5,000, some arson investigator training for, I think that's $13,000 contractual services with the doctor that we use to debrief on traumatic incidents for our firefighters and police officers. Smaller items like that will reoccur something other than every year, we're plugging into the one-time account as opposed to the annual account. And again, the idea is to preclude budget creep.
And question, Mayor, will those items come back to us on council for approval?
They will be part of the overall budget. So next week, when we do departmental budgets, by all accounts, if you want Chief Fish to tell you, to demonstrate for you how they recertify those bottles, he will and can. And so we can get, when we do the departmental budgets next week, yes, you can get to that, to granularity.
No, but what I'm asking is, will the request come to council for approval?
For like the purchase of those things?
Correct.
Not necessarily, depending on our policy. If something $5,000, probably not. That's within the spending limit of the department. If it's something, let's say that if it's a larger item, buying an engine certainly would, but the engine purchasing of engines and trucks would be in the budget already as part of this discussion when we do capital and fleet. I think on study session number 3, I'm trying to find a good one that would be something that would come back to you. So let's say that in Public Works, the Los Angeles imagery it's a GIS system for Public Works that we anticipate would cost $80,000. That would have to come back to you as a procurement because it's over the $55,000 or $50,000 limit. So a mix of ongoing stuff and one-time stuff. Okay, so what does it look like? $213.5 million in revenue. The $900,000 we would pull out of the fund balance by design to pay for the hourlies in Community Development Department, Building Safety Division. And then the use of fund balance, that $525,000 that would help establish the Department of Innovation, Performance, and Audit. And ultimately bring us to almost $215 million of appropriation. Okay, so what does that do to the projection? So we would be at 59 million as of 7/1/17, so the beginning of the coming fiscal year, $59 million, 27.7% is the projected reserve.
Mr. Ochoa, as we become more and more involved with various transportation projects, and I've spoken about this in the past, I think the city does need a transportation expert on staff. Would that be an additional person to this, potentially, if we go forward with that? Or would that person be hired as part of
That's a
an
great
existing department, and therefore his salary is already accounted for?
That's a great question because we are recruiting an assistant director of community development now that would have that item in their purview. And if we needed an additional transit planner, for example, that probably wouldn't be in general fund, but that would be one of those positions similar to what Councilman Najarian had requested. Can we bring it back when that first person gets in place, they get to hire their team if in fact we need that body. And I'm hoping that we will need that body. But that would happen, if I had to guess, first quarter, maybe mid-year of the coming year. Probably first quarter though. And it would be, like I said, it would be non-general fund if I had to venture a guess at this point. So you wouldn't see it here, but you would still see what the appropriation would be, and you would see the position description. Okay, thank you. And kind of to Councilman Sinanian's point, we talked about what happens with the stabilization. It is reflected here, understanding that you see $2.5 million in the coming year. Obviously, that's a reflection of what council would give us as a way of direction. And the projected reserve, you see it at 26.3%. That reflects moving 2 previous years of investments into that trust fund is reflected in the $26.3 million. Again, that only happens if council gives us that gives us that direction. So again, so you've seen kind of where we expect to end the year. You see where it is that we look like we're going. 5-year financial forecast. We are effectively structurally balanced, and by the time you look to 21-22, as the mayor has indicated, our economic development program, we look at it as our business plan. We're looking to grow the dollars that will keep us in balance as we adhere to all of our costs and obligations. So let's talk about those obligations. If we were to lose general fund transfer, this is something that the council is probably well versed in because we've had this discussion both in terms of discussing the GFT as well as examining what happens with Measure N. If you recall the election from year before last. Last year. It all bleeds together, I'm telling you what. It all bleeds together. So some of this will be familiar because the dollar amounts are similar, although the GFT represents a greater chunk of the general fund revenue structure than does the portion of Measure N that was being challenged. By way of background, the city charter contains the discussion by way of transferring of 25% of the operating revenues from GWP to the city unless we determine that it should be a lower amount. That language or that structure was put in place by Glendale voters in 1941, then again in later in the 40s, and effectively stayed unchanged for 50 years, for nearly 50 years, until Prop 218 comes into play and adds a few new wrinkles, then followed by Prop 26 and a few more wrinkles in terms of the city's ability, even as a charter city, to transfer revenues. Today, as was noted earlier, the current transfer is $20 million, about 10% of electrical revenues. That is, as a percentage, down from what it had been over the last several years by way of direction of the council, that you would drive that percentage down to the 10% in order to remain competitive in electrical revenues. And of course, the city ceased transferring water revenues in 2011-12. The lawsuit was brought by the Glendale Coalition for Better Government and IBEW. We lost at the trial, but we are moving through the appeal process, and we are hopeful that we will see some good news by way of either the state Supreme Court or, if need be, the appellate court. If unchallenged, keep in mind, if unchallenged, the GFT does not revert to 2011 or 2013 levels. The entire GFT is gone. The lawsuit postulates that the general fund transfer, the rate structure featuring that general fund transfer is illegal. And if it is illegal, then you can only charge the amount of the service, and that the GFT itself, by way of being increased vis-a-vis the new rate structure that is deemed to be illegal, is no longer allowed to be charged. So as the judge had indicated, the general fund transfer was in fact grandfathered in until such time as the rate structure was changed. Of course, in understanding that, you would expect that rate structures do change. Rate structures have to change because the cost of the service changes. The judge determined that he would not necessarily rule in the city's favor on that course. So the idea being that the GFT is gone, $21 million. So what does that look like? $21 million you see on the left-hand side. That looks like green on the left-hand side there.
Is that the indication for money?
That's how much it represents, about 9.4% of the overall general fund for the 17-18 proposed budget. And on the right-hand side, you see the matching appropriations by way of department. As we've indicated, police and fire make up 2/3 of the general fund. That is not unlike most every other city that you'll come across, independent city with its own police and fire, that has those services. And then you look at the other departments from the quality of life services, community services, parks, libraries. You also see a sliver of community development and public works, because much of those operations are outside of the general fund, and all of our internal service departments from HR to ISD to finance and what have you. So what does that mean? If you take away the $21 million or the $20 million, then you have that hit. What could you do with to make up $20 million? You could reduce all budgets by about 9%, a little over 9.5%, almost 9.5%. You could effectively eliminate library arts and culture and the community services and parks operations by reducing them by 88%. Or you could level that hit at police and fire, seeing as they are the biggest chunk of the general fund. Now, in doing that, again, this sounds somewhat familiar because we ran through this exercise by way of Measure N. You know that our operations as an independent city with our own municipal police and fire, the responsiveness, the customer satisfaction, and the cost, we really outperformed our partners in the county. Without any disrespect to them, it's just a service model. So the idea here is that in not only contracting out, if you could do that, you would actually have to reduce the level of service in order to achieve the savings that would be contemplated by the loss of the GFT, which again has been in place since the 1940s and voted on twice by Glendale voters. By the same token, I think we're just opening up a new library or a refurbished library last year. That doesn't seem to be something that our community is wanting to do. And if you use Measure N as any yardstick, you will know that well more than 2/3 of our residents had indicated that they would rather go on continuing to pay a fee that they are paying today in order to realize the benefits of the services that they receive today. This is just another representation of what those options look like. You see the option 1 reduction, and it's easy to say 10% or 9.4% of police, but when you realize it's $7.5 million out of their budget, and where would that come from, and how many officers would Chief Castro have to drop, now it starts to become very real and something that is less palatable to our community. So it's a question that's out there. We just want to show you what the impact is, and then we can move forward from there. This is just a discussion about ultimately what gets reduced if you had to go that direction. 30 full-time positions in police, 15 full-time positions in fire, and the elimination of some of our special programs. Based on where we are, I don't know how much value it is to go too deep into these particular weeds, but the council should know that this is something that the staff is contemplating and preparing for as conservative planning and contingency planning would dictate.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Councilmember.
So when you say elimination of about 30 police full-time positions, 15 fire full-time positions, if you deduct 9.5% of their budget, or this is if the option 3, which was totally deduct that 20 million from fire and police.
Yes.
Which one is it?
This is option 1, right? So this is the loss of $7.5 million from police and $5.4 million from fire is represented here. That's the 30 and the 15. If you were to effectively eliminate CSP and parks, that's the option 2. And if you were to take the entire $20 million from police and fire, that's option 3.
Yeah, but if option 3 is applied, how many officers and how many firefighters we will lose?
I think that it shows here 90 full-time positions. The parsing between the two departments,
40 and 50. 40 fire, maybe 50.
40 fire and 50 PD. At that point, I don't know that these two departments could survive as independent departments, I think is the takeaway. You'd be forced to try to contract to the county and reduce the level of service, because the county is still wanting to get paid for their level of service. The county has many of the same pension obligations that the city of Glendale has. And so at the end of the day, the only time you're going to realize true reduction in cost is in an economy, the economies of scale. So you can get rid of your police chief, you can get rid of your fire chief, you can get rid of a couple of captains, maybe several lieutenants. And then once you do that, because you're relying on county sheriffs to provide command staff to provide those services, or county fire command staff to provide those services, then at that point you actually have to cut line bodies in order to get to that goal.
Okay. If you reduce 9.4%, amounts to 7,500,000 something. If there is 30 officers, they're going to lose. It means the average officer gets 250,000.
All in with all of their costs, including pension. That was the slides that we were showing earlier. Yes.
Okay. This is average we are talking about.
This is average. Yeah.
Right.
So that's pension. That is the cost of the entire employment cost. That's what one of those bodies, insurances, everything. That's what it costs.
Okay.
So very quickly, the profile, you see kind of how we track along the right-hand side, 17-18, what we're proposing. Modest increase in population by way of the State Department of Finance. The adjustments that we are recommending, that we will get into more detail next week, would leave you at 1,587 full-time equivalent bodies, down from 2,000 in 2006, down from 1,847 from four And I have said before, I will say again, I would be greatly surprised if we ever get to the other side of 16 in the foreseeable, 1,600 full-time equivalent in the foreseeable future. When you look at the general fund FTEs, you see that we are serving more people more people per full-time equivalent. And you look at what we're doing by way of residents served by FTE, it's up a little bit. Again, showing the demonstration that we hope to achieve is that we're creating value. We're able to do the same amount of work, serve a greater number of people with the same service levels. And when you look at what our cost is per capita, a little over $1,000.
So, in terms of the total employees, I understand this is the budgeted number. In reality, how many employees do we have and how many vacancies do we have?
We are still hovering around, I want to say 9 to 10% vacancy, which is high. One of the goals you'll see next week for the HR department is to drive that number down.
So about 150 vacancies.
Yes, sir.
It's north of that.
180, I'm sorry, it's a little over. 180.
Wow, I mean, that's a lot of bodies, right? I mean, that's
Yes.
a lot of, so everyone else is picking up the slack for those empty spots?
Yes. I mean, I will tell you that the degree of pride from your department heads and from your operational managers is significant. You know, are there mistakes? Are there gaps in service occasionally? Occasionally, yes, but that is the exception and not the rule. I think if you pound for pound, we still provide a very high level of service, even with that degree of vacancy. But again, I think you'll see that vacancy number will come down to the 5% range is our target.
Okay.
But you have raised it, and I think Mr. Agajanian is referencing it as well. In terms of what the market is, you're going to the market saying, hey, we pay average, but our equipment is great, our council is stable, and that our management is moving forward in a way that you don't have to worry about, are we still going to be, do we still have jobs, do we still have some degree of stability and respect, both from council and from management. Those things are very valuable, I will tell you, in my experience doing this for 24 years, to folks that are working in municipal service now. That said, nothing says I love you like money. And so we are out competing. And so we're trying to sell. I think you'll see in Mr. Lanzafame's brochure for his new assistant director, or the same body that was reallocated for the assistant director position. He's pitching the opportunity to work in Glendale, the very exciting projects that we have in Glendale, the leadership of the Glendale City Council, the vision of the council, the stability that you find in our operations, and the expert staff. So we're saying that there's a value proposition beyond the paycheck, but we can't be Pollyanna-ish and say, that doesn't matter. We know it matters. We've gotten, I think what you'll find from Mr. Doyle is, especially for some of our key positions, we go out angling and fishing and hunting for specific types of folks that want to work in this environment. I think the days of the cattle call are probably limited for us because we can't compete at that level.
So what seems to me to be pretty high rate, vacancy rate, that's explained by what? I mean, why are we short 180 people?
I think it's a function of folks that people sometimes don't want to come to work in government. The economy is doing a bit better. And so when that happens, we're generally going to lag behind. For those positions that are more technical, professional, they will do some comparison shopping with other agencies and determine that they want to work someplace else for a little more money. What we see with, and I'm actually a big fan of millennials, but what we see with millennials increasingly is that they are not so, they're not so entrenched in the idea that if I come and work for a city, I'm going to give you my career and I'm going to be here. I think that mindset is something that is probably the Gen Xers are the last of that. Certainly the baby boomers are. And the millennials are more apt to bop around. And so I think what you'll see by way of part of Mr. Doyle's strategy is how do we further create an environment where people don't want to just leave? Because the stuff that we do here is pretty neat. It's pretty supportive. You're not going to find this in other cities. And so it's a combination of all of those things. But the money is important, and it is expensive, as Mr. Agajanian indicates. But when you're talking about police and fire, I mean, at this point, it is, especially for police, it's a seller's market.
Which brings me to my next question. Are the vacancies sort of evenly spread throughout the departments, or are there specific departments, specific professions that are creating most of these vacancies?
Police is a significant one, and a lot of our technical professionals, electrical engineers, some of the folks in Mr. Galanian's shop, but we also have trouble recruiting qualified drivers. I mean, part of the other issue that we have that contributes to this mix is in an environment where everybody, a lot of younger folks, not just younger folks, a lot of people, post everything they do online. You go do a background check and find out that, you know what, maybe we can't hire you for any number of issues. That happens to some degree, but the idea that we're missing bodies throughout the organization, a lot of times it's going to be technical professional and it's going to be public safety, and generally speaking. But we've had a hell of a time. It took us, we had to go to Clark County, Nevada to recruit an assistant director of libraries, because those folks that are highly qualified in our region, their departments do, their cities do what we do. We do a great deal of talent evaluation, and they are keeping a pretty close hold onto their bodies and not letting them venture out. And they'll do that comparison shop and they'll stay where they are. So we're having to, again, go hunting very specifically as we recruit, as opposed to just doing an open position call. It is a challenge. This speaks back to that notion of intellectual honesty by way of the council. You see that on Glendale, Burbank, and Pasadena, property tax per capita, and keep in mind these are the numbers that you see along the bottom are the 16, 17 numbers, not the 17, 18 numbers by way of per capita. But using that, with that said, we're at 274 versus Burbank and Pasadena. A big chunk of that has to do with the land use mix that we have that really is not going to change in very dramatic ways. Most of our buildable area is indeed going to be residential, even when we talk about what happens in the downtown and some of the other interesting areas of town. And keep in mind that we get less of that sales tax dollar. What you see is of the proposed, or I'm sorry, of the 1%, what did I say, sales tax? Yeah, I'm sorry, of the property tax dollar. These ratios have been frozen in time under Prop 13. And you see that we are at about 13.7 cents on the dollar, as opposed to other cities that get 19 and 20 cents. The city of LA gets well in excess of 20 cents on the dollar. And that effectively, until there is any kind of change to Prop 13, just is not going to vary. So when we look 13.57 cents as opposed to 18 cents in Burbank and 21 cents in Pasadena, that contributes to the numbers I showed you on the previous slide. By the same token, when you look at sales tax numbers, because so much of our land area is residential, we are at a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to generating sales tax. We get it from a very limited handful of places. That means that when we focus on the downtown, we are constantly trying to maximize the value of the investments that are coming into the downtown, both by way of the improvements so that we realize property tax, as well as the ability of folks to generate economic activity by way of buying and spreading that disposable income throughout the businesses that you see all around the DSP, up in Montrose, and even down around the South Anchor near San Fernando Road.
Excuse me. Why is it that sales tax is so different between Glendale and Burbank, and specifically we have these great automobile dealerships? They just have one.
Because they have a great deal of their land area, much more of their land area is usable for retail sales. So they have that entire Empire Center that is there off the 5 freeway, generates an enormous amount of sales tax. They have IKEA that generates an enormous amount of sales tax. They have a mall that is middling, that they probably will reposition at some point. But the point being that much more of, if you look at a land use map from either of these two cities, you'll find a much more balance in terms of residential versus industrial for job creation versus commercial and retail. Ours, when you look at a land use map for the city of Glendale, is overwhelmingly residential for those areas that are usable. And so much of when you look at a map of Glendale, so much of our area isn't usable by way of the San Rafael Mountains, the Santa Monica Mountains, and the San Gabriel Mountains.
So it's a good thing we have the Americana.
Yes. The Americana is probably The Americana, the Galleria, and the Brand Boulevard of cars are the holy trinity by way of our sales tax generation. Utility user tax, again, this is a function of the rates that we charge. We are generally less than our neighbors, and the relative competitive pricing that we have by way of water and power, the areas that we control. So when we look at our budget for the coming year, how do we spend our money? Well, you see it's broken down between department types, public safety being police and fire, public works and utilities being, along with GWP, community services and transit, so on and so forth. Not a whole lot of change. Some increase in public safety. Some of that's going to be due to the MOUs. Some of that's going to be due to the helicopter that is set to be purchased, as well as some of the fire apparatus that's being purchased in this coming year, that's being proposed to be purchased. The public works utilities are a reflection of the projects that are underway by Mr. Galani and Mr. Cern. And you see a drop-off in quality of life spending. Don't let that fool you. That is merely a reflection of the fact that last year we budgeted the big chunk of those DIF dollars. You budget them once, you don't need to budget them each year. That was those carryovers that we showed you in previous slides. So it isn't as though your funding for operations has dropped off. It's just that you budgeted all that money for parks, new equipment, and we aren't having to budget that again this coming year because we're actually doing the construction now. Overall, it's a 2.2% increase, a modest 2.2% increase in your appropriations. At the direction of the mayor, I will power through these next few slides as he directed. And so this is just by way of keeping score. You know what these numbers represent, and so our target here is to keep over all of the entire city budget a net of transfers or CIP, because CIP can vary, as I just explained, by way of the DIF funds. We try to keep all of our personnel expenditures less than 35% of overall appropriations. You see on a citywide basis we're able to do that. We meet the target at 33.5%. When you look at the general fund, our target is 75%. Good news is that we're driving the number down. We're getting closer to our 75% target. Bad news is we're still not there. But you see a 0.5% reduction year over year. Also direct your eyes to the employee count, and by way of just stability. Times have gotten better. To Mr. Sinanian's point, things have gotten better over these last several years economically, but the council has held the line, not going hog wild and adding back a bunch of positions. In fact, we've been able to keep things relatively tight. This comes up every now and again, are we top heavy? No, absolutely we are not. 17% of all of our, of the employee count, it's only 11.2% of our employees are managers. 88.8% are non-management. If you look at that by salary, still less than our target of 25%. We're at 17 versus 83. So we continue to be very streamlined by way of management. One other, the questions had come up by, from the mayor by way of general edification of the council, because we have discussions about the types of funds that we have. We generally have two types of funds, government funds and proprietary funds, but in the government funds, there's 4 different kinds. There's the general fund, which is the largest of all of them, $215 million for the coming year. Special revenue funds, this is where we get monies from other subventions from other levels of government, and there is very strict restrictions on how we can spend these. So you're going to see our HUD money coming in to special revenue funds. You're going to see any kind of grant dollars that are coming through the state of California into special revenue funds, transit dollars coming in. Debt service, we only have one debt service fund. That takes care of the money that comes in for long-term debt. And capital improvement funds, this is the 401 fund. This is where we do all of our parks, we do our street maintenance, anything that has to do with the infrastructure. In terms of our proprietary funds, there's enterprise funds and there's internal service funds. As you know, enterprise funds function more like a business. So there is a charge for service. Those dollars come into the enterprise fund, and we have revenues and expenditures all happening within the enterprise fund. with the exception, of course, of our charter-required water and power funds. I think if you look at the sewer fund, or if you look at the refuse fund, there is those services that we offer. We get a fee from customers, and all the transactions happen within those funds, within that one structure, unlike the antiquated charter required funds within water and power, where we are obliged to move money around to matriculate it in antiquated accounting that just hasn't been updated. We also have internal service funds. These are the funds that are charged by ISD by way of by workers' comp, other business charges that are levied on internal customers, on our the various line departments. So when you look at what the total amounts are by way of the proposed budget, 836 total budget, 836,409,000. You can, as I said, the general fund is by far the largest of the government funds, followed by special revenue at 98.7. Debt service funds, a modest 2.2 million, because the city honestly doesn't carry very much debt. The capital improvement funds are there at 16 million. And the enterprise funds you see under proprietary, that is water, power, sewer, and refuse. And then the internal service funds, as I mentioned, everything that we charge back as matters of business as from one department to all the various client departments, HR, what have you. So overall, you see that it is about a $2.1, $2.2 million increase year over year. When we look at appropriations for the general fund, a great deal of stability, not a whole lot of change when you look across the general fund. I'm sorry, we're looking at general fund, I'm sorry. Total general fund, I will draw your attention to in the middle there, continuous improvement. We didn't change that. We've been battling whether or not it was going to be continuous improvement, performance, and audit. It's going to be innovation, performance, and audit, IPA, for those of you who like to drink beer. The idea being that we have a great deal of operations. We have a number of very important projects underway, and as you saw in previous slides, we are very streamlined with department directors doing the work that they should be doing by way of the operations process, the people process. I fear at times we don't do as much as we should or could on that strategic process, and everyone can use a little bit of help. At the same time, we have the audit function that we want to restore to its own independent status. You recall that up until, I believe, 2013, audit was its own department with its own department head. We're looking to restore that, so it's just, again, going back to what we had before. But in doing so, taking somebody who is not an auditor and putting them over that audit function. Why? Because the auditors are focused by their very nature, by their ethical limits, to look at compliance, to look at the areas for weakness, for areas of loss, for problems that exist, and opportunities for improvement generally are left off. The idea of solutions and helping a department implement solutions really doesn't come under their purview, and nor should it, because their job is to audit, not necessarily to rectify or fix. I think it would be a tremendous asset both to the internal audits that we complete as well as to the departments that they are completed on if we have a department that is charged with stepping back from all of the audit work that's done, looking for the patterns, looking for the trends, and looking for ways, conventional or otherwise, to innovate within our departments. And innovation oftentimes is confused with used synonymously with technology, and that is not quite the case. This is something that really kind of grew out of this tech initiative brought forward by Mr. Sanayan, that you see most progressive organizations, public and private, utilizing innovation, not just as an afterthought, but as something that has to be part of the DNA of the organization. This is our commitment, this would be, if council approves, our commitment to innovating both through technology as well as process innovation, looking at the way we do things and trying to find more efficient means of doing that. You'll hear more about this next week. Yes, sir.
So two questions. One is, I mean, at some point, I'm trying to go back, was it 2013, 2014, where we got rid of the audit department?
We folded it into finance.
Folded into finance. And now we're taking audit out.
As
The
promised.
question is, why are we going back and forth? I understand that this time around it's more than audit. It's audit plus how do we deal with any issues that audit reveals. And second question is the budget that's going to be allocated to the CIPA. Is is that an all-new budget, or is this just money that would otherwise go to finance, now it's being just brought over to this new department?
Less than half of that number would be new, $525,000 as I recollect. The other part are the existing costs for internal audit. So you have a director, and I do believe it needs to be a director if they're going to be standing nose to nose with the police chief or fire chief or finance director to say, this is what you need to do. And again, that's restoring the executive position that used to be over audit, and having a project manager to work through some of the issues, helping departments get them to where they need to be, and then a significant chunk for maintenance and operations by way of contracting services, professional services. You'll see futurists, you'll see technologists, you'll see consulting, other professionals from any number of fields having the ability to bring some of those subject matter experts into the fray to consult, to provide some information. Because the idea being, what we're trying to do is get somebody that can identify all of these opportunities, marry it together with industry literature or whatever the information might be, and then apply it. Why would we be taking it out of finance? A couple of reasons. I think the council's concerns when we put it into finance were understandable, that we need to have audit as a standalone function. And as we had said then, and we would say now, we generally agree, and the idea is to bring it out and have it stand alone. But I would tell you that having it stand alone just as audit is only part of the equation. I think you need somebody, if we're going to make audit even more useful than what it is today, is have somebody who really is not an auditor be able to say, this is what's happening, I understand what the audit says, and here, department director, is how you can take those observations and apply them in a way maybe you hadn't thought about. And by the way, there's an audit that's going on in GWP that's similar to the one that's going on in Public Works, that maybe those two department directors who are moving so fast don't have the opportunity to make that connection. Somebody will help make that connection for them. To the extent that we generate on a quarterly basis a great deal of management data, key performance indicators, I think to the extent departments are moving fast enough that they'll look at their sheets once a quarter, understand what's happening, and then file it and go on to the next thing. Having somebody that will look at it, compare it with other cities, with other states even, and say, okay, well, this is how this city is realizing some benefit by kind of turning that information on its head.
So, since we are spending additional monies for this department, I mean, there's money that would otherwise not be part of the budget. We will have quantifiable, result-driven analysis of what's happening, what they're doing, how that's benefiting the organization overall?
Absolutely. That's a great question, because the idea here is to demonstrate some ROI. Show me cost savings, show me productivity savings, show me something that this isn't just keeping up with the Joneses because all these other municipalities across the country are moving in this direction formally and integrating audit into their operations. It has to be more, it has to be real. And so, yes, absolutely, you will have, as we move forward in the coming year, the first order of business is identify the metrics, help us understand.
And that will be brought to us on a quarterly basis or annual?
Quarterly, along with all of our budget information. If council would like to see it more regular than just broken out from just our budget updates that we do quarterly, by all means, I would be excited to share that information with you.
I think we have to, right? Because, again, new money's being sent in a certain direction. We want to know why.
Yep. And if it isn't, if it doesn't work, sir, I will be the first one to tell you. If it doesn't, then we have to find a way to fold it back into the organization. There's a different way to innovate, and maybe the idea is to provide some additional bodies to departments. That way they can do it on a departmental basis. But I think this is a little more. There's an economy of scale in creating this one department, especially if we already have the audit function and we want to build around that audit function, make it more valuable.
Councilmember Dewan and Councilmember Aguilar.
Okay, my question has to do with personnel. Is this 3 new positions, or are these going to be promotional, or?
This would be 2 new positions, so it'd be a department director and a project manager. And then the rest would be done through, it's kind of exciting. We have, we do the Glendale innovation teams. So with innovation teams, we bring cross-section of department employees, all levels, to look at a citywide issue. That's what's got us the One Glendale program, our social media apparatus, all those were GITs. We also have, as you know, graduated Lean Six Sigma employees. So in collaboration with GCC, we have sent, I want to say, close to 20 employees to learn process innovation by way of Lean Six Sigma. So they are kind of a cadre of existing employees that we could have seconded to this effort on a project-by-project basis. Through the collaboration with the Fine University of Southern California, we would utilize interns in their master's program as a function of their capstone project. So the point being, I think for the price of 2 full-time bodies, we can leverage a large number of staff, if you will, without having to pay for that staff necessarily.
My question is similar to what you have been asked. So we're going to have new department, performance and audit, right?
Yes, sir.
And there will be only 2 employees in that department?
2 new employees. It would be all the existing auditors plus.
So from the other departments, you will move few employees to this department?
From finance, we would move the 4 auditor positions into this operation.
And
Plus-
the extra money will be 1.2?
The extra money would be 525,000, not 1.2.
But from the budget of finance will be reduced from?
Correct.
Yeah, that's the
Yeah.
part of the reduction up there, the 400. There were some increases
I'm sorry.
in finance.
You're not seeing it on this. That's, where are you?
Oh,
Oh,
up the
administrative
top,
services.
yeah.
Hello. Yeah.
All right.
Some people call them finance. Some people call them administrative services. So we're basically moving the audit function
So
out
the
of.
extra money will be 1,250,000.
The extra money should be about 525,000, Audrey, for this operation. Yeah.
The net.
525,000.
But the difference will be 1.2 million.
No, the total cost of the department would be 1.2 million. The incremental increase, the marginal increase would be 525,000.
Okay.
Because there's a reduction in administrative
The other
services.
department.
So again, you see, I mentioned police, you see an increase in terms of overtime, you see an increase by way of MOUs, you'll see an increase by way of the new helicopter appropriation. Also, it's worth noting, this is the last year of the retirement incentive. You recall that we did as a means of reducing workforce, we went with a retirement incentive. That is now, as of 16-17, paid off. That's why you see a reduction of 100%. This is just a listing of all of those. I won't go through everything, but council asks how many different funds are there? There's this many funds.
67.
There's 67 funds that that the finance kids get to keep track of, and they do a tremendous job of it. We will be providing to you as part. This is a description of their appropriations, not fund balances, appropriations. So as your when your departmental presentations come next week, we'll provide you with the respective fund balances for each one of these departments. I would tell you that the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is going to be the one that we will be watching very, very closely in the coming year as we begin to seed a great deal. I'm sorry, we're looking at the Low Mod Housing Income Fund. I'm sorry, my bad. We are looking at growing that fund to about 18, 19, maybe even $20 million over the coming year and a half as we realize monies that would come in from the former redevelopment agency, monies that would come in by way of the ADI settlements, monies that would come in by way of program income. And this summer, the council, you'll see as part of the department's strategic goals for the community development department will be the establishment of the strategic plan for affordable housing, where you will program those dollars into projects and priorities that you want to accomplish in the coming years. But again, you see that there are a number of different funds that are fit the descriptions that we shared, government funds versus the enterprise and proprietary funds. With that, this is just a teaser for next week. You'll see in the capital, or 2 weeks from now, capital improvement fund. You'll see that we are moving monies into the CIP. And we'll give you a very good idea of the projects, some of which you'll be familiar with, others that will be relatively new, that will be on the laundry list of things that we hope to accomplish in the coming year. But a great deal of excitement for this coming fiscal year. Enterprise funds, I will tell you, based on, I should, just to circle back to council, we talk about the sewer fund. As council members have voiced their concerns with doing a sewer rate plan during the same period of time that we are working through the general fund transfer litigation, that our plan is to withhold the sewer rate plan going forward, work through the GFT lawsuit and presumably the water structure lawsuit, and then bring to you rate plans in the next fiscal year, the 18-19 fiscal year, with water, power, refuse, and sewer. While Mr. Galani would love to see a rate plan move forward this year, it's been 18 years since we've changed the rates. He can wait one more year. Rubik? All right. Again, these are internal service funds. You get the idea. The compensation insurance fund, building maintenance, applications and infrastructure for ISD. I won't bore you with the details, but you have the presentation. And this just shows you how all of those appropriations break out over these different fund types. If you have specific questions about them, we can pick them up next week, or staff will stick around to answer whatever questions that you may have. Here's the summary of all of those operations. You see the biggest chunks are in the enterprise funds, obviously, and of course the city's general fund. That gets us to $836 million, $409,000, 2.1% increase. Next week at this same channel, we will be presenting, recapping, there it is, we'll be recapping information that we have provided today, as well as presenting all the departmental dashboards and the department strategic goals. Hopefully, if we've done it right, the department strategic goals that you'll see for the coming fiscal year should mirror all the things that the City Council has outlined as priorities for the coming year. You will see that we have all of our KPIs, which will be part of the dashboard, which really are the outputs of the departments, and the department strategic goals all are the outcomes that feed the City Council priorities that you establish. So there's this cascading relationship between the priorities to the strategic goals to the KPIs, and you will have that full appreciation for that next week, and certainly we'll have that opportunity to give us direction and to adjust, less of one thing, more of another. Some projects need to be pushed forward, others can be delayed. Hopefully we've matched up our work program next week with what your priorities are. Lastly, May 16th, our anticipated third and final budget study session, if that is council's pleasure, will be focused on CIP, as I mentioned just a bit ago, as well as the handful of new fees and increases for the coming year. I assure you there will not be any discussion of newspaper racks or billiards tables.
Or mills rate.
Or mills rate. Lastly, as I show here, June 6th is the hearing, the 13th is the adoption. And at that point, we will be ready for the new fiscal year. So if there's any adjustment or any other questions, the only recommendation that we would have for you today is note and file the third quarter report and provide the appropriation for the $4 million transfer of one-time monies from the current fiscal year to the street maintenance fund, building maintenance fund, and CIP fund for use in Fremont Park's renovation.
Is there a motion to note and file?
I have a question.
Oh, you have a question? Go ahead.
Mr. City Manager, you put together 42 pages of information, and this is my first day. How come I didn't have this?
Because you were sworn in last night? No?
Is this the way you treat the new kid on the block?
I'm sorry, sir. We will try to take it easy on you as we go. I do take for granted the fact that our city council is updated on a pretty regular basis, and certainly at the quarters when we do our quarterly budget updates. I'm sure you'll be able to adapt to that very quickly. But more specifically, and to Mr. Najarian's point, this is a budget workshop. So by all means, we have between now and 3 o'clock when the afternoon meetings start. If you would like to get into a tremendous amount of detail, we can do just that, either as a group, if that's the mayor's pleasure, or one-on-one as we go forward.
Mr. Agajanian, Councilman Agajanian, don't feel too bad. It happens to every one of us when we get elected. Before you're swearing in, there are some laws
I
that you have
had
to follow.
this binder
The binder is different than.
Whatever I-
But, right, but,
But I didn't have this.
but don't feel bad, it happens to every one of us. So
Okay. I take it.
with that, is there a motion to note and file?
And also a reserve appropriation, correct?
Yeah. Yes.
So moved.
Second?
Roll call, please.
Councilmember Agajanian?
Yes.
Devine?
Yes.
Najarian?
Yes.
Sinanian?
Yes.
Mayor Garabetian?
Yes. Is there anything else on the agenda, or just adjournment?
Yes, I do need to read 1B, resolution of appropriation in the amount of $4 million to the general fund, of which $3 million will be transferred.
Sorry,
There was
we
a
just did that.
It's part of the motion.
As part of the motion.
No, file.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second?
We are adjourned.